Hello and welcome again to another episode of SacTown Talks. Today we have a special show. We have Paul Mitchell and Anthony York joining us to talk about Scott Lay, the founder of this podcast, and kind of talk about his memory and his meaningfulness to Sacramento politics. Guys, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. And Scott's done so many great things, and especially on the tech side, forming the Nooner and kind of getting a lot of the news out there and kind of Sacramento gossip, and kind of talk about him. And I guess Paul, you've known Scott the longest. Can you tell us how you met Scott and kind of what you guys were doing?
Yeah. And first, thanks for having me. I think that Scott would love that we're talking about him.
He's got a lot of good press, man.
I know. It's when you talk about Scott starting this podcast, he started so many things around Sacramento. And when I first met him, we were starting a Democratic club. I said that we met in the quad at Orange Coast College. We knew each other from a speech class that we had taken together, but we met one day in the quad, and either I was walking back from the administration office or he was walking back, but we met in the quad, and we were both that day going to start a Democratic club. And this was in Orange County. This was in 91. This was very deep red Orange County, behind the Orange County, very conservative. And the student government gave us the whole runaround about not wanting to approve our posters and all this stuff. So we decided to run for student government together, and we got elected to the student board and got involved in. We did kind of these two different paths. One was doing the political stuff with the Clinton Gore campaign that election cycle, and then working in like kind of young Democrat stuff. That's where we met Jay Hansen and Tafara Gabary, who's now at AFL-CIO in DC. And Jay Hansen's a fixture here in Sacramento. Then our other path was student government. From that board position, Dustin, who was our political ally at the time, it was like a little threesome there. We kind of talked him into taking over his student government at the neighboring community college. And then we went to the state community college student association called CalSac and kind of took that over. And we just kind of were like running through this stuff and had crazy amounts of energy. I'd never worked so hard, putting together plans and memos and ideas. And he started his first blast email called The Donkey's Mouth. That was like a blast email that
in 92 what year is this?
Yeah, like 92, 93.
So they had email.
We had an email account that was a shared email account. This is how old it was. We had a shared email account. We had to get internet access through dial-up modems, and we had to pay this dude in Garden Grove a $15 check every month to be able to call into his house to like get our modem to connect to the internet. That's funny. It was like we were using Pine Email, which was like the text-based email program. We were telnetting to, like, the Secretary of State's office had like you could telnet and download bills. And this was like old school, crazy, like early internet time. And so his energy, how hard we worked with the student government stuff, the political stuff, it really did kind of become the template even for like the work I do now. My style of working now is born out of like me and Scott writing memos about what we were going to take over in student government. And like anybody who's worked with me knows that like if you work with me on something, a memo's coming pretty quick. Like I like the way I work and the way I think and the pace that I like to work at, and all that stuff was really forged in those early days with Scott in student government. And the joke was that Dustin was like our child. Dustin Corcoran's now the CEO of the California Medical Association, and people think it's funny, but he was like the little mute love child of me and Scott. And he just like kind of followed us around and never said anything. And but there was this excitement and energy, and it carries through to like my work, and it carried through to so much of his work. And so all of that and the things that he created here in Sacramento makes all of this really, hard to.
How old were you guys when you started this? 18, 19?
So he was only 17 when he left high school and started going to community college because he had health issues as a kid, and he couldn't get the classes, get through his traditional classes. And the school found that like it was easier just to get him like the GED. It was a version of the GED, which was for kids who wanted to graduate high school at 17 or whatever. And so he did that and got his GED and went to community college. And so I met him there. He was probably 17 or 18. I was older. I'd kind of had my own struggles as a kid. I went to rehab when I was 17. I, bounced around a little bit and found myself at community college. So I was probably like 21, 22, and he was around 17, 18. And, so we were young. And
that's amazing.
We kind of learned a lot of this stuff together,
Right. How'd you guys end up in Sacramento then together?
Well, what was funny was through the student government stuff, Scott became the policy director for the California Student Association for Community Colleges, came to Sacramento, then got me to run for president of the association, got Dustin to run for policy director. We all came to Sacramento and we're doing student government stuff. And I mean, me and Dustin were constantly in Sacramento, and Scott as well. We were all three constantly in Sacramento, lobbying for bills and doing student government meetings with the state chancellor's office and all that stuff. So we really built this connection in Sacramento. So when Scott went to UC Davis for undergrad, Dustin and I went to American University. We always knew we were coming back to Sacramento.
Right.
And so after we graduated AU, Dustin came straight back to Sacramento, actually took Scott Lay's lobbying job at the Community College League as his first job. And I went to USC for grad school, then came to Sacramento in 98 to work for the California Medical Association. So Scott and Dustin and I ended up being in the California Medical Association, Scott at the Community College League. And we just knew that Sacramento was where we were going to be,
right. Yeah, the early years of the California Medical Association could be its own pod. Oh,
I know, the Steve Thompson kids. I mean, that would have been the Steve Thompson legacy passing through to Dustin.
It's cool how you guys have that relationship.
The group, even my wife was
started,
at CMA, yeah.
Definitely. So Anthony, how did you then come to meet Stop? Was it through that kind of CMA stuff? Or?
No. So I came up here. So there were two things happening simultaneously. I met Scott in 97. I came up here. I was a journalist. It wasn't even the Sacramento Bee. McClatchy newspapers had a bill tracking service called Legitech, and through Legitech they started this new thing. It was an internet publication called Capitol Alert, and I was the first Capitol Alert reporter. So this was 1997. So
kind of like how they have now. They have like Capitol Alert. They do. Articles.
Yeah, although it was a freestanding, it was separate from the Bee. I mean, now it's more integrated into the Bee itself, but it was a standalone internet-only publication, and no one really, and in a town that didn't have any. I mean, this was sort of the earliest days of internet publications. I think Salon was publishing already, Slate magazine, and not a whole lot else. And so a lot of traditional newspapers were just starting websites and things like that. McClatchy invested in sort of capital only coverage, internet coverage, and I was the first reporter. And so Sacramento at that time, the term limits law had passed in 1990, but phased in 1996. So in December of 96, a whole new crop of legislators had been sworn in. It was sort of the first term limit class, and with them there was sort of this generational churn going on in Sacramento. At the same time, so with these new members, a lot more Latino members and a lot of younger members, was sort of a generational shift, and they brought a lot of young staff with them. And so these current sort of overlapping, as the internet was creating opportunities for young journalists like myself, term limits was creating a lot of opportunities for young staffers. And so there were people like Dustin and Paul, and young lobbyists as well. So I met Scott. He was a source. Right. I was covering the budget, and Scott knew the difference between Test 1 and Test 2 and Prop 98. He knew what ERAF was. I mean, he was somebody who who had a policy understanding of what was going on, and was also part of sort of a cadre of staffers that I met that were my age. A lot of reporters here, and it was sort of an older generation of reporters. They weren't talking to a lot of the staffers that I were. And so I was getting a different kind of information through people like Scott. And it really was sort of a different kind of coverage. I think that portended a much larger change that was going on sort of generationally and culturally at the same time. And a lot of it was and then the technological stuff happening simultaneously. It was just sort of this unique moment. We didn't know it at the time, but I think that's where I first met Paul, first met Scott at that time. And we didn't realize we were part of this sort of generational shift happening. But in retrospect, clearly
what a cool time, I guess, to be kind of young and kind of get into this business in that late 90s. Because as I remember it, things were, a lot different back then. A lot more gatherings and things like that. So that must have been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember that Clinton signed the welfare reform bill in 96, right? 96. And it had turned a lot of power over to the states. I was like, oh, well, and I was a political junkie forever. I was like, well, Sacramento is really going to matter now because all this money. And I mean, my first day on the job, I went to a Pete Wilson press conference. I mean, the barriers to access in Sacramento were so much lower than they were if you were going to try to get to Washington. So, it was an exciting time.
I guess, that's one thing kind of you pointed out on Twitter is Scott the advocate, budget wonk, knew everything, great on the mic. That was a great testimony you saw. Can you kind of tell us about how Scott was as an advocate working for the league and, how he learned everything in the budget and everything like that?
I mean, definitely tireless and passionate. This was also a time where there were fee increases happening every year at UC, and so the fight for access was one that I think Scott was driven, that drove him,
right.
Coming through the community college process, sort of taking his own sort of non-traditional path. He was not only very knowledgeable, but extremely passionate. And that can be a dangerous combination in politics, right? To have that level of knowledge and passion, but that Scott clearly had.
Yeah. And he definitely had a little flair too. I remember one of our first big events was in community college. We had this funeral for education. And I still have one of these little funeral placards. And we had a funeral gravestone for every class that had been canceled that year because of budget cuts.
Right.
And it filled up the quad. And, Scott and I were on TV and it was this whole thing. And he was constantly focused on these things about, access to the community colleges, whether it was fees or, just programs and services for people who are kind of the underrepresented in the community college system. And he was really progressive, or really passionate about a lot of progressive causes, and took that kind of student lens to his work, even when he was representing the chancellors or the superintendents and the trustees at the Community College League. He was very much like working for the administration, but with a student lens. Mm-hmm. And some of his, testimony in the Capitol, like that snippet that Lance Lewis found, was, him being really passionate. And And like Scott said, there sometimes is kind of this gulf between those who are the most activist and passionate and those who knew like the actual legal stuff. It would be like you'd have the rabble-rousing activist, and then you'd have like Rick Simpson, who would be the only person who actually knew what the actual law said.
Right.
And Scott blended those two things. And then one of the most amazing things about Scott was I became a policy expert in higher education policy. So I was the chief consultant to the Assembly Higher Education Committee. I knew a lot of this stuff, but I basically built up walls. I was like, well, I know higher ed, but don't even bring me a K-12 bill. I don't want to read a K-12 bill. That's too much. I'm not going to read that. And then I ended up getting a job working in K-12. So I became kind of an expert in some K-12 policy, but I was like, well, just don't show me a water policy. I don't want to pay attention to that. Right. But Scott was the opposite. Like he knew so many crazy different policy areas and just soaked it all up. I haven't even told you this, but I went by his house with the family as we're going through some stuff. And there was this, like just a notebook. And it was notes of him being on the phone probably with people. And it was bill numbers and issues. And it was just like, it was insane, like the stuff that the way he was so connected to so many different policy areas, talking to so many different, almost like a reporter's instinct with that, like just absorbing this, and his ability to absorb and transfer that information to people. I talked to a friend, Evan McLaughlin, who also works for us in the redistricting stuff, and he said that when he was chief of staff to Lorena Gonzalez, he would be in like a 45-minute meeting with somebody about a policy. And at the end, he'd be like, I could have just read this all in the Nooner. Like, why waste my time for that?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's sort of where and that's how we connected as well. I think I was a journalist that wanted to be a policy wonk, and Scott, as it turned out, was a policy wonk that wanted to be a journalist. Little did I know when I first met him, but by the time I came back, I had left Sacramento for a few years and came back in 2003, right around the recall, the Schwarzenegger recall. So 2003, and reconnected with Scott then. And that was sort of where we got the kernel of the idea. Paul and Scott had come up with their idea for the Capitol basement, right? And sort of this kind of gossipy news aggregator site at the same time that I was thinking about the same thing. And so the three of us found each other then and
yeah, the idea at the time there was this little trend that was happening of people doing these blogs, and one of them was like the Charles Schwab elevator or something like that. Like a guy, it was like a persona. It would be a persona of like some guy who just happened to hang out in the elevator at Charles Schwab, and he would be telling all these kind of secret stories that were happening in the company. And that was the vehicle for this news blog. And so we were thinking of the same thing, that it would be like a guy who works in the cafeteria at the Capitol just telling stories of like what's really happening in the Capitol, you know?
The elevator person.
Yeah, totally. Helen. Helen was the elevator. Helen was the elevator person's name.
The elevator people.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it was sort of indicative of being sort of like young, smart-ass kids, which we were in our 20s, but also the culture was changing, the media culture was changing, and technology was changing to create a lot of these opportunities. And there was a new audience. I mean, there was a different kind of audience that I don't think there was for state news and gossip, 15 years earlier. I mean, for all the talk about Scott as a policy wonk and a serious advocate, he was also an incurable gossip, right? Which I think is part of the combination and that's evident in the Nooner and how it's written and the voice of the Nooner. I mean, that shines through too. And it was sort of, so I mean, among the many things, I mean, he was a policy wonk, an advocate. He was an autodidact and like taught himself, how to like tech skills that none of us have, but I think incurable gossip is also part of the mix that's kind of fundamental to who he was and the work that he ended up producing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the cool things you guys were talking about. I guess a lot of the tech stuff he was doing, like he did an early bill tracker, things like that. Yep. I guess, how did he have the time and energy to, do all this stuff?
That's a good question. And, I would ask myself that question all the time. I mean, literally, when we started the Roundup, he was CEO of the Community College League. And I would wake up at 5:30 to start, the Roundup was like very similar to the Nooner, sort of a news aggregation site, sort of written through in paragraph form. I mean, there's a lot of publications like that now. There weren't at the time, and certainly not for Sacramento. But I would wake up at 5:30, 6 o'clock every morning to start, and Scott had already taken a first pass and done it. So and had fixed what was wrong with the email distribution and had fixed the website. I mean, so how he found the time and energy to do all that stuff remains a mystery.
What was the revenue model? Just ad based? You had to like sign on
there was no revenue.
There was no revenue, right?
No, we're doing it for fun.
Yeah. I mean, and
5:30 in the morning for fun. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a weird idea of a good time. But that was, but yeah, and that was it. I mean, it wasn't, I think Scott would have loved to have been able, and ultimately he was able to make a living doing the Nooner, but long before he could make a living doing it, he was doing it basically as a volunteer. I mean, a little bit of money that maybe covered the server costs, but certainly not enough to make a living on. So
yeah.
But it was I think a testament to his passion, that he had these strange hobbies that benefited a few thousand people, and those of us that came to rely on it every day.
Right. You were talking about kind of like the anonymous blog, Helen the elevator operator. We see it on Twitter all the time. We see people with these, anonymous Twitters.
Yeah.
Bacteria Bear.
Right.
That was his.
Excuse me.
Who now we know who Bacteria Bear is.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was going to be a revealing podcast. Yeah.
So how many anonymous Twitters did Scott have? Why did he do the Nooner under his name, and why didn't he do it under something else? Did you guys ever talk about that, or do you ever think about that coming out?
Well, I do think it's clear, and like if for folks who read him, I mean, I think that he wanted to be in the mix, right? And this was something that sort of emerged, right? I think the time that I knew Scott, he was in some ways sort of more behind the scenes. But I do think he had that interest in somewhere along the way, wanted to be recognized for the work he did. And I think he was proud of it. I mean, I think all of us, he had heard from so many of us that marveled at his ability to produce stuff in his free time, that eventually I think he wanted to put himself out there through this persona that was crafted, right? I mean, like the persona of the nooner, where the nooner ends. I mean, the nooner is reflective of Scott, definitely, personally, but like everything, like all of us do with our, through media, whether it's social media, I think there was something of a, I don't know, there's a performance aspect to it as well that
and I also think he was just a fan of so much of it, and he wanted to be in it. And so, like, I remember when we were in community college, we get excited when we found a Dan Walters column.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, a Dan Walters column, or Pat Morrison. We were actually quoted in a Pat Morrison column, like in community college, and it was like the coolest thing in the world. And like
that is geeking out.
Hard. So I actually had was looking through old messages with him, and I found this one. I was like, oh my gosh, Sherry Bebbich Jeffy quoted me, and it was like, that's amazing.
He's still my heart.
Really. So and he, while he was in this mix with so many political people, he also still was a fan of the politics. He never lost that kind of like wide-eyed excitement of like, oh my gosh, a congressman just texted me, or that he's messaging back and forth with the governor. And so, and he wouldn't miss telling me that. He would be like, oh yeah, I was texting with the governor about this. And it's like, okay, Scott, cool. You got your little fan moment. And he was a fan of it all. And he had this, and I think that's actually kind of cool. Like, I think a lot of us come up here, and a lot of people in Sacramento come up here. It's kind of second nature to be like around people who are political, or be like, on a text chain, or playing poker with a member of Congress or something like that. But for him, it was like, he still loved that. And if he had been anonymous, he wouldn't have gotten that like feedback loop that I think he really wanted. So I think that was important for him.
I guess, how did he do that? He kind of detached himself from, the policy world and started, doing the nooner full time. How was he able to, I guess, to keep those relationships with electeds and kind of get the access to the governor and things like that?
I mean, I think by putting himself out there, and again, I mean, some of it was just sort of force of nature stuff, and coupled with the media world really changing during that time too. And I think Scott sort of rode that wave to an extent and pushed it here in Sacramento. I mean, that distinction between where a policy person ends and a journalist begins, I think has really evolved a lot since Scott's career began. So I think that's part of it. But it takes a lot of persistence. I mean, you got to want to do it every single day. And that is, and ultimately, I think when it came down to it, that was the life and career that Scott chose over. Like, he wanted to do that journalism. I mean, it really is journalism. Even more than he wanted to be an advocate.
Because, that's one of my favorite parts. Sometimes Scott would drop some bombs in the nooner, and he'd be like, wow, really? Like, somebody told you that? Like, a member told you that? I'd be like, what members are talking to you, Scott? Like,
and I would get calls.
We always assume it was you.
No. I would get calls with like, can you tell Scott to stop saying this, please? Like, it would be like something about a speaker's battle or something like that. And I'd get calls from people like, can you please tell Scott to stop doing this? I go, look, if I tell Scott to stop, he's just going to do it more. So let's just try and ride it out.
Yeah.
And then other people would be like, they knew that you could feed things to Scott, and it was a way to trial balloon things, was to get in the nooner. And it was a way to, actually people viewed it as legitimate of a part of the thing creating the Sacramento narrative around bills or campaigns or whatever. It was just a part of that. And so people who were smart in this world knew to like stay close with Scott and to like feed him some stuff and like make sure that he could be there for you when like you needed something to kind of get plugged. You could kind of pass it off to Scott, but he could also be somewhat erratic sometimes. And if he glommed onto something, man, like he was just going to ride it out. You just had to like wait for him to stop posting about it.
And let's be honest, he didn't bat 1,000, right? With the stuff he published, right? And so, I mean, my training is much more through the traditional journalism, but that's part of what, part of the excitement of it, right? Is that you don't have to go through a lot of those channels. But the Nooner, he was flying without a net. I mean, there were, I would joke with him often about how he could use an editor.
It was like a political page 6. Like sometimes you just read that thing and you're like, really, that happened? But you're right on the nail. Like, the gossip in this town is, some of the biggest parts. And, Scott was able to capture a lot of that and share it with all of us.
Yeah, for this very sort of niche community, right? I figured that like the expanded community, the big number is 10,000. There's probably a core number that's maybe 20% of that. Right.
Yeah,
that really eats this stuff up. That would know who half the people we're talking about even are. I mean, you know them. They're your listeners, right? But catering to that community, was something that Scott ultimately dedicated his life to.
That's I guess one of the interesting things, just learning about Scott and reading, all these obituaries in the LA Times and stuff, and how awesome that is. But here he is. He's got his GED, goes to community college, gets his degree, goes to law school. Passes the bar. Like this guy had a lot of options. Did you guys ever talk to him about his interest, I guess, in practicing law or doing other things, or
Did he take the bar? I was having this discussion.
So he took the bar and he passed. He got his law, but he did not fill out the part where he didn't pay the fees and he didn't do that letter recommendation part. Whatever you have to do, don't you have to have like statements?
Moral character. Yeah.
So he didn't do those, and he didn't pay it. And I was always like, Scott, why didn't you do that? I have another friend that did the exact same thing. Passed the bar and just never became a lawyer. He wasn't interested, and even when he was doing the Nooner, and even when like things weren't going well, he still wasn't interested in taking a regular job in a building,
or staff job, like committee.
Yeah. He never was committee staffer. He was never in the building. Yeah.
I don't think. Yeah. Never worked for an elected.
No.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And, I guess, just kind of following him on Twitter and just like seeing he was always interested in new stuff. He was always like pushing the limit, whether it was like going to Mexico, eating tacos, or going to the farmer's market, always talking about the tacos he eat, religion, Buddhism and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Kind of what are some of the stuffs, knowing Scott for so long that he was always kind of out there kind of pushing things on, kind of some fun stories you guys remember?
God,
this is a family podcast. Right? I don't know what we can share. Too soon, maybe. I don't know. No, I think you hit on a lot of the stuff, right? I mean, going to Mexico, fishing trips in Mexico were a big thing for him. I think
roulette,
he developed.
Wasn't it
craps? Yeah. But yeah, and I think again, like the social media persona, right, where he did publish. I mean, it was like that created its own following, right? Mm-hmm. That I think he cultivated and enjoyed in the same way that he enjoyed the Nooner, right? Posting about his, trip to the Sunday farmers market or the taco trucks outside of Southside Park. Right. I mean, like, those were for those of us that read Scott regularly, and that was as much a part of it. I don't know, what are we missing? I know there's stuff. I have recency bias.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, so. He cared a lot about a lot of different communities. He cared a lot about the cystic fibrosis community. He'd grown up as a kid with really, really bad asthma to the point where like he would go to cystic fibrosis summer camps. Mm-hmm. And, all his friends from when he was 15 years old and going to these summer camps, they've all passed away. And so he will get to watch like all his friends dying through his early 20s, early 30s. And so like caring about that community, his license plate used to be Fight CF. Mm-hmm. Caring about those communities, but really at some point he turned all his attention to this project, the Nooner, the persona that he had, that trying to get that out there. And I think that one of the things that is being missed a little bit and that's right now is that a part of the reason why he was doing so much of this was because he was hurting. Mm-hmm. There's another side to this story about Scott, and it goes back to as long as I've known him, that there's, he's had things that were paining him as a kid, and things that were paining him as a young adult, and things that pained him in relationships. And it was almost like the more that he was having trouble, the more he pushed the gas pedal. And it was everything on the outside, the blast email campaigns, the work, the being the CEO, the speaking, the nooner stuff. All this stuff was, him almost obsessively building this thing because he was having other issues, and that was the thing that was fueling him day to day.
Right.
That's why he got up in the morning. That's what he did. And there was some amazing things, like when we first did student government, he used to always be sick every year in the hospital for months. And it wasn't until he ran for student government, got involved in this politics, and found this external energy thing could help fuel him and help kind of like carry him through. That was a part of Scott, was that feeling like this hyperactive, obsessed, pushing out things was what would make things okay. That was what fueled it. And we as Sacramentans and people in the political world and the policy world benefited from that hyperkinetic energy that he had. But the thing that I hope doesn't get lost is that, he was also hurting.
Yeah. And that's always something, when you saw his social media, you realized he lived alone, and he'd kind of talk about some of these things once in a while in the Nooner on Twitter. And it was kind of, interesting kind of seeing, how things progressed and how the kind of pandemic and everything was happening. And, I was, keeping an eye on seeing, how he was doing, what was going on. Kind of in the last year, kind of, were you guys able to communicate with him much or talk with him?
Yeah, sometimes. So the pandemic wasn't good for Scott, but it was almost the life he was leading even pre-pandemic. It didn't really change a lot of his, he basically hold himself up a little bit. His wife, Kara, prior in the early, around 2013, 14, she was really involved in trying to get him into rehab. And then in 2016, he went into rehab again. And that happens to be why we have his passwords, because Anthony was covering for him on the roundup and the Nooner. So in the last year, I think it was bad. There were, some times where I basically had to break into his apartment to go check on him and make sure he's okay. And he was always, things are going to be good. I'm going to get sober. I'm going to do this stuff. And, then we knew that there were problems, Yeah. He was pretty isolated.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's always a tough thing to deal with, you have someone on a course and, how do you get them off that course? And it's a tough thing to deal with.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
And especially when you have that dichotomy with the public persona, right? Which, sometimes the stuff there were sort of no boundaries. And if you read the Nooner every day, right? He would share, some might say overshare, but definitely share what was going on. But then at the same time, I think a lot of people, would have no idea. I think that a lot of the persona that he cultivated through the Nooner that was his mask in a lot of ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
To cover up what was going on. And so I don't think that's uncommon. I think you see a lot of people suffering that are that produce a lot, right? Whether that's art, musicians, artists, whatever. And I think Scott was no different. I think some of the same sorts of things motivated him.
Right.
So.
I guess, now since you have the Nooner passwords and everything, how many subscribers did he have? How
Several
many people
thousand.
was he reaching?
Well, I don't have access to the list. I just have the content. It's a very bifurcated, God only knows somewhere.
I think it's over 20,000, isn't it?
Is it?
I think so. Yeah. I think it's over 20,000.
20,000. That's amazing.
Yeah.
A lot of those might be people who were in politics for a little while and then left, and they're passing through Sacramento, and then they just always still have the Nooner. But something around the 20,000, I know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't tell you anything about that, but I can update the email subject line and content field.
Yeah, that's it. And we don't know how to turn it off.
Where when it stops, nobody knows.
Yeah, I saw you had that the posthumous motion machine.
The posthumous perpetual motion machine. Yep, that's.
We don't know what we're going to do.
Yeah, because it will be, if you were a Nooner subscriber and you don't unsubscribe, you will. get an email from Scott every day in your inbox at 11:30 or 12, depending if you were a paid subscriber or not, from now until 2038, maybe.
And then Scott would want you to know, if you are a paid subscriber, he will extend your subscription.
He will. Wait, yeah,
That's
if
right.
he will extend it for the time that he's not able to make
That's
content.
right.
He will extend
That's
it.
right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
You're good.
So it's
Yeah.
kind of like this void is now there, that Scott kind of filled this like interesting kind of media void for a lot of us.
Yeah,
kinda.
Anthony, you're going to just take this over and write this now
What's
every
the
morning.
next step? What's in
Are you kidding?
anything in the works, or anything you kind of point us to that might be comparable?
I don't know. I do think that in some ways what we consider now mainstream media in some ways has caught up with a lot of of that kind of journalism. I mean, there was no Politico Pro,
Right.
I mean, of course, the Nooner was $40 a year, $50 a year, and Politico Pro is slightly more.
Yeah, way
than that.
more. Yeah.
And different, right? I mean,
Right.
it doesn't have the same kind of it's not exactly the same. I mean,
Right.
Scott's stuff was even more insidery. I mean, I don't know, but I'm not aware of any plans. I'm sure that, there's another generational shift already underway,
Right.
in the Capitol. I have great confidence that, that others will step into that space and,
Right.
and provide, some, although it won't be quite the same. I mean,
Yeah.
I think, Scott was a singular voice, went about it in his own way. But yeah, I mean,
They say all information wants to be free. And it's going to get
is
out.
everywhere in chains?
Yeah,
Is that Rousseau? No, it's
I don't know,
people,
but
anyway.
it's like a hacker saying, I
Yeah.
guess. And so the rumors and the stories and the stuff, it's going to get out somehow. And I think we'll miss Scott's voice. I think we'll miss his energy in that Nooner. But I have a lot of confidence that somewhere there's some 20-year-old in a community college, rabble-rousing,
Right.
gonna come and take up where we left
a
off.
little bit of free time on their hands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a cool thing. You guys have started, I guess, a scholarship fund in Scott's name. Can you kind of tell us about that?
Yeah. So Orange Coast College, which is where we went to community college, we contacted them right away. They set up immediately a memorial scholarship. We would love for people to donate. It already has over $20,000 in it. It's
Wow.
going to be an endowed
That's awesome.
scholarship, which means that whatever money's raised, they're going to calculate the interest essentially and whatever would come from that amount of money.
Mhm.
And every year do scholarships to that amount so that this goes on in perpetuity in his name. And I'm hoping that next year that I'll get to go down to the community college. And David Grant was the college president when we were students, and he's actually still on the board of trustees. So we're hoping that Dave Grant and I can give the scholarship in his name.
That's awesome.
And there's a link to it if you want to check it out. We can send it to you as well. But if you go to Around the Capitol, which is the website that hosts the Nooner, there's a link to the scholarship fund there on the
Okay,
site.
and we'll
We can
link
amend
it.
that too.
We'll link it to this too.
Yeah, it updates the website and the email.
Oh, okay,
yeah,
cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. That's great. That's what you guys have a goal of how much you guys expect to raise, or
Well, I don't know.
it's pretty impressive what you already got.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people. There's some people whose doors I'm going to go knocking on and say like, "Hey, it'd be great if you gave a little bit of money for
Yeah.
this."
Why are you looking at me?
Not with
Yeah,
yeah, associations, other groups that I know benefited from Scott's time here.
Indeed.
And so I haven't done that yet, but we've been getting a lot. The guy who runs the scholarship program at Orange Coast said that his phone goes off every time somebody makes a donation, just because he's
Right.
like, and he said it's just been incredible. He says like every hour there's another little bleep on his phone. So
Yeah.
That's great.
yeah.
Yeah, just seeing on Twitter, like, just at the outpouring of
Well, and-
reporters and politicians.
Yeah,
it's just
Adam
been
Schiff
amazing.
tweeted a whole thing.
Yeah.
Jimmy Gomez
Yeah.
tweeted a
Right.
thing. A bunch of members tweeted things.
Obits in the LA Times and the Bee, which, I think we pointed out Scott would love all of
He
that.
would have loved
He
it.
would have
Right.
loved it. Loved it.
That's funny. Yeah, just
Yep.
reading his attorney general appointment, speculation, and then some
Yeah.
Adam Schiff
Sneaking his
tweet
friends in
about
there.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so funny in retrospect.
I have no idea who his sources were.
Well, what's funny is I actually found it this morning when I was walking the dogs. I was looking through old Facebook messengers, and it was that whole thing about who are the potential attorney general candidates.
Uh-huh.
And and appointees, and we were talking about Rick Spur. He was like, I think I want to put Rick Spur in. And I'm like, okay, cool.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Speak it into existence.
That's right.
Exactly.
You gotta have some fun.
Yeah.
Exactly. Man. Well, thank you guys so much for coming by and talking about Scott. He's definitely a big influence on a lot of things around town, and he'll definitely be missed. But thanks for sharing a little bit about him that a lot of us didn't know. So,
Of course.
thanks a lot.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you.
Great.